Hey everyone, it's Michiel, Beautiful Bean Juice. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be talking about something that is a bit of a curse word in the coffee world, which is decaf. So actually I know James Hoffman recently did a video on decaf, which is very insightful. So if you haven't watched that, go check that out. But what I want to talk about today is how to brew better decaf filter coffee. So if you like to drink decaf, you want to brew filter coffee, 5 tips on how you can improve that experience. So I'll start with tip number 1, which is buy good decaf coffee. So for me, good decaf coffee is decaf coffee that still has some acidity, that isn't roasted too darkly, especially if I like to brew filter coffee, and that has actual flavor notes. For me, the best results have been ethyl acetate processed decafs from Colombia, because like James mentioned in his video, there's a big processing plant for ethyl acetate in Colombia, so there tend to be a lot of coffees with this process coming from there. I feel that this process maintains the most of the original flavors of the coffee, so I found the most success with the Swiss water processed coffees I have tried. I did not like them as much. My favorite ethyl acetate Colombian is actually this one from Manhattan, the El Paraíso decaf. So this is by Diego Bermudez, which is quite a famous producer. It's a very interesting decaf that actually has a lot of acidity remaining for a decaf, and it's something I really tend to look for in coffee. I really enjoy acidity, so that's also what the tips for today will be geared towards, is also getting some coffee that tastes like a fruity coffee with some remaining acidity. So I personally really like this Manhattan coffee. It's one of the very few coffees that I've bought more than once. So I tend to like to brew a coffee once and then discover something new. But I've had a very hard time finding good decafs that I like, so I've been buying this Manhattan decaf for quite a while now, and I still really enjoy brewing it. Additionally, I've recently bought this one from Sprout, which I also think is a very good coffee, which I really enjoy drinking. I personally prefer this one on espresso. It's an omni roast versus a filter roast, so it's a little bit darker, it's a little bit less acidic, so I tend to think it makes a better espresso than filter coffee, but it does both quite well, and I really enjoy each of them. About that, so personally, I tend to really try to look for filter roasts in decaf, and there's not a lot of offering in there because decafs tend to be roasted a bit more darkly, so they're often sold as espresso. I do feel if you're trying to brew filter coffee with them, these espresso roasts will often be disappointing and not be as good, although if you follow the tips that I will give you today, you might be able to get a decent cup out of them. But if you're buying beans, try to look specifically for filter roasts because it can really make a huge difference. I'll start with tip number 2, which is brew with less agitation. So that means don't swirl, or at least minimize the swirling when you're brewing the coffee. So a lot of people, when they brew coffee, they like to swirl the bed to level it. Decaf produces a lot of fines, so because of the additional processing. So if you swirl, the bed tends to stall, the brew will take forever to draw it down, and you get a very muted and kind of boring coffee. Decaf doesn't have a lot of bitterness or astringency, so you won't really get that typical over-extracted flavor, but it would still become a bit muted and lack acidity and become quite a boring brew, so I would still want to try to avoid that. Additionally, when you pour, I would suggest doing less pours, so doing a recipe with maximum of 2-3 pours. I tend to like to bloom, then do a single circular pour up to half the brew weight, and then finish with a very slow center pour, which doesn't really agitate the bed and just kind of levels the water on top. So also the style of pouring is important. Don't agitate the bed too much while you pour. Don't pour at a high pace, or don't pour very frequently. That's my personal preference because I like to maintain some of that acidity, and I don't want to increase the extraction too much because high extraction decafs tend to taste a bit decaf-y and will lose some of that fruitiness and that acidity that's already not there in such high quantities. My third tip would be to reduce the temperature. So when you reduce the temperature, you also increase that acidity. You lessen the risk of over-extraction, especially because the brew times can still be quite long. So sometimes I hit a 4 and a 4.5 minute brew times just because of the amount of fines. And then it's good to know that you're hitting lower extractions because of the lower temperature. I tend to brew at around 90 degrees. If I'm using a Great Kano, if I'm using my V60, or if I'm using, which is made of glass, or I'm using the MK dripper. So those are both brewers that absorb a lot of heat. I might increase it to about 93 degrees, but mostly I'll brew it at 90 degrees. Tip number 4 is grinding coarser. So again, this is to reduce the number of fines, to make sure that your brew doesn't stall, to make sure that your brew continues to brew properly. Also, coarser grinds, again, with these longer contact times, will make sure that the acidity remains. If you grind very fine, you have this long contact time, it will become more over-extracted and a bit muted. So a coarser grind can really help in maintaining that acidity and making sure that it's a vibrant and fresh cup of coffee. Alternatively, what you could do is grind quite fine, but really, really minimize agitation. So there's, for example, the single pour recipes. There's an Oreo single pour recipe, which requires little agitation and quite a fine grind that I've had success with. I'll link the recipe in the description. It's actually also the one I brew in my Oreo review. That can be quite successful with these coffees, but it's not universally successful. So I would say if you're trying to brew a decaf coffee like you would a regular V60 or a regular pour over coffee, it tends to help to grind a bit coarser. Just for reference, so if I'm on my CP6, I would usually brew between a 4.5 and a 5. I will now brew between a 5 and a 5.5, so about half a step up. I've even gone as far up as 6, which I've never gone that far up with a regular coffee. And it can really help in maintaining that acidity, if that's there in the coffee, right? Some coffees have just been roasted too dark to kind of still have that acidity and it's just gone. But like, for example, the Diego Bermudez here, it really still has that acidity and it's very pleasant if you can maintain that. Then tip number 5 for me is an optional tip. So it's not something I always do, or it's not something I always feel the need to, but it's increasing the ratio. So adding more coffee for the same amount of water. So let's say I usually brew like 15 to 250. So 15 grams of coffee, 250 grams of water. I might now brew 17 or 18 grams of coffee for 250 grams of water. This is mostly something I do if the coffee is a bit bland or a bit boring. So like decaf sometimes just doesn't have as much taste as a regular coffee, and you can kind of increase the presence of flavor by increasing the ratio. But I found that for a lot of decafs this isn't necessary. So for example, again, the Manhattan one, I really don't do this. I've never done that. I mean, I've tried it and it didn't make much of a difference, or it wasn't a big improvement. While for some others, for example, for this one, I tend to actually really enjoy what it does when you increase that ratio, because it just makes the flavor notes a bit more pronounced. Although if the flavor notes aren't there, if the coffee is roasted too much, if it just isn't a good quality decaf, increasing the ratio won't fix that, right? So it's assuming you have bought a quality coffee and maybe it's a bit old, or maybe it's just a bit bland and you want it to be more punchy, you want it to be more similar to regular coffee, you can increase the ratio. So those are my 5 tips. So tip number 1, buy good quality beans, probably the most important one. Tip number 2, lessen the agitation. Tip number 3, brew at a lower temperature. Tip number 4, grind coarser. And tip number 5, increase the ratio. Those are my main things that I do when I brew decaf, or that I do differently from how I usually brew. Additionally, it can help for certain brewers to buy filters that are less likely to stall. So for example, for the V60, those are the Cafec T90 or the Cafec Albaca filters. I tend to find that those are less likely to stall than the original Hario filters. But at the same time, with these tips, it shouldn't be necessary to switch brewers or to switch filters just to get a good cup. You should be able to get a good cup with any brewer and any filter if you follow these tips. So what do you think about these tips? Do you like them? Is this also how you brew your decaf? Do you brew differently? Are there any additional tips that I've missed? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and have a beautiful day.